I'm speaking to Lord Greenhalgh, and very grateful to you for spending a few moments with us this afternoon. And I just wanted to ask you about your time as faith minister during the COVID pandemic. And first of all, what was it like being faith minister during that time?
Well, it's extraordinary, really, because I was made a minister in the middle of March 2020 and introduced to the Lords about a month later. And within a very short period of time, COVID struck. I remember it very well. My mother died on the 3rd of April 2020 of COVID. She'd been perfectly well. She'd hosted the family round for a Sunday lunch, the grandchildren, her grandchildren, my wife and I, my father, and clearly they started to isolate, and they were the vulnerable, but they isolated when they were told to, and she suddenly got so ill that she had to go into hospital, and within 3 days she was dead. So I was already a minister then. I was already the faith minister.
Yes.
Against that background, and it's fair to say that if you remember, I had some introductory meetings, and for government to interact with faith communities, it was typically a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury, a meeting with the Chief Rabbi, a meeting with Cardinal Vincent Nicholls, and then suddenly COVID strikes, and all the places of worship were closed. If you remember, the Archbishop of Canterbury sort of famously started to carry out a service from, I think, his kitchen from memory. And that happened, and it was quite clear that there's not been a closure of that kind. And I'm not someone who's an expert in ecclesiastical history, but there hadn't been a closure of places of worship for many, many centuries. So the Prime Minister recognised that there needed to be what he called a COVID-19 places of worship task force.
Yes.
And he brought me into his government, and I was, the faith minister amongst other things. And he asked me to co-chair that with his Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick, and we launched that. And that was all about how safely and quickly can we reopen places of worship.
Yes.
So that then became suddenly very clear that government couldn't continue with its very narrow engagement with faith communities. And we started to hold and use Zoom and Teams more aggressively than we may have done historically.
Yes.
And started to engage with wider faith communities that exist out there. And that included all aspects of Judaism, not just the Orthodox tradition under the Chief Rabbi, but also the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi, the liberal, the Reform, and then again the Hindu different groups, the different elements within the Sikh community, and also obviously Christianity being very broad. And I was helped immensely by Colin Bloom, who was a faith advisor at the time, who seemed to have an amazing Rolodex, and Justin Helliwell, Jonathan Helliwell, sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
Jonathan Helliwell was number 10, and Colin was essentially an advisor in the department working on a project. But we sort of worked together to engage with faith communities, I think, in a reasonably effective way. It certainly became much broader, our engagement. And we listened very, very carefully to what people wanted. And people wanted for places of worship to be treated appropriately.
Yeah.
So, but what I tended to find was my lowest point was when I could go shopping in Tesco's, but I couldn't go to my church to pray for my mother, who was a very devout Roman Catholic, and she used to go to Lady Chapel. And for Roman Catholics, private prayer is very important. And we were totally stopped. And yet I could go into a supermarket where transmission rates were far higher. I think that was a low point when I had to sort of discuss and defend a policy that I didn't really believe in. But that's, I didn't want to resign. I was doing lots of other things. But I think government didn't have faith-aware people at the heart. I think the advisors around the Prime Minister did not have the right view of how to time the opening. And I think we opened up our faith institutions, the churches, the gurdwaras, the chapels, wherever, the temples, the mosques, a bit later than we should have done. That was the mistake, if you like.
Yeah. I suppose it's a fair question as to whether the the fundamental core policy was right, but then there's a question as to whether the application of it was consistent, and whether the understanding of faith communities was sufficient to apply that consistently. So yeah, I can understand all of that, and I'm sorry for all your personal tragedy, kind of weaving through that as well, and having to deal with that at the same time. Do you reckon that the core policy to close churches was reasonable?
The initial one, I think it was too far, if I'm honest with you. You shouldn't have closed it blank. I mean, what was at issue for me was whether you should congregate in a place of worship when we didn't know anything about the virus. Yes. I think that was reasonable to stop that. But what wasn't reasonable was to lock the doors.
Yes.
And then the next mistake was not to open them up to communal worship sooner than we did. So I think it was two mistakes in terms of policy. I think your challenge around application is fair, although I think my officials did quite a good job of trying to get the guidance to be consistent, even if the application wasn't. And that's because, of course, you're dealing with local government who you can get the same set of rules, but interpret them differently. And that's part of the nature of our system.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, the guidance that came out was pretty clear, and it wasn't that hard to interpret it. I must say it was good guidance. My only issue, and a number of our churches, was with I suppose, what the guidance was saying. It wasn't that we didn't understand it. It was at times we didn't always agree with it. And yeah, there was the whole kind of garden centre open, churches are closed. There were moments during, say, the November lockdown where it was a bit.
Yeah, that's right. It was November, the one towards the end of the year.
Yeah. And then there was a feeling, I know amongst our church and other places, that we were scrupulously keeping the rules, and we felt like we were a very safe place.
Yeah.
And yet, we were still being kind of held back in lots of ways, compared to other sort of environments. What do you think about faith literacy in government more broadly? Do you think?
I think this isn't just about politics. This is about government. That's what I'd say. There is a poor understanding about the importance of faith within what is essentially we do have a very secular society, but we have very strong faith communities as well.
Yes,
I think there's a latent mistrust of faith communities amongst officials. Now, I've served 20 years in local government, 16 years as a councillor, 6 years as a council leader, 4 years as deputy mayor to Boris, as mayor, when he was mayor, as deputy mayor, and also 2.5 years as a minister. And I felt the officials, if we look beyond the ones that specialised in faith matters, the general literacy is poor, the sense of suspicion is high. Are these people just proselytising? What's their agenda? It wasn't recognising that you have this huge sea of goodwill that you can put to good use by working together and enabling things to happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any big lessons, if you were addressing, as you sort of might be, a little group of church leaders who are meeting in a couple of weeks' time as a kind of bit of a longer distance reflection on COVID, what would you want to say to us as lessons you've learned that you think we should learn as church leaders?
Well, I think understanding has to be two-way. I've just admitted openly as a former minister, and openly as someone with experience at all levels of government, that officials and politicians need to do more to understand faith communities. But equally, faith communities need to understand more about how government operates, if that is going to work. Because there are opportunities to coalesce, as I tried with the Faith New Deal idea that seized on Danny Kruger's point and looked at seeing how we could work together for the common objectives. And that does require faith communities to understand how taxpayers' money is spent, have a respect for that, go through the processes that you need to do. But equally, for officials to try and understand that faith communities must stay true to themselves. They mustn't change just because they're working on a project of mutual interest.
Yes, no, that's fair. Did you have any reflections on whether the COVID lockdowns were reasonable? And it seems to be not being considered by the inquiry. The inquiry seems to be more about process than the big principles about.
I mean, I'm surprised we are not featuring in this inquiry. I think that if there are lessons to be learned. Faith is important, and how we manage our relationships between state and our faith communities is important if we have another pandemic, and that we don't make the same mistake twice, because that
Yes.
was my definition of stupidity. If we
Yeah.
make the same mistake twice, we really haven't learned from COVID. Having said that, what I would say is there are some beautiful examples of where faith communities stepped forward during COVID, particularly the rollout of the vaccination program, where actually it was places of worship, whether it's a cathedral or a church or a chapel,
Yes.
place of assembly, a mosque, a gurdwara, a temple. Actually having those in those places meant that there was a much greater trust in the process of vaccination, and the rollout happened quicker, particularly in some of the more deprived and minority communities.
Right.
The black churches also played their part. It was very important. So that was a point of celebration for me.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.